Hello there, people of the internet. My name is Baz and I am the narrator of this audio horror story. The story was originally created by T.W. Burgess, the author of this channel. We decided to work together and create this kind of audio immersive horror experience because I, for one, love doing that kind of thing. I love narrating. I love creating like an immersive world through audio design. And this one's called The Knife Sharpening Man. The story is about a suburb called Kelldale where all these like rich people live, and they're kind of quite far off from society, where they feel they need to order in services like laundry, meats, stuff like that. And one of those happens to be a knife sharpening business, which is extremely niche. But it basically follows an urban legend of what these Kelldale residents have to do in order to avoid a certain fate that you're going to learn about in this video. It's a brilliant story, and if you guys enjoyed this, then let us know in the comment section down below and leave a like rating, because it would mean the world, and it will show that you're interested in potentially more things like this. Without further ado, here is the story. I hope you enjoy.
Should you pass through Kelldale on a warm night in July, then you should be wary of the knife sharpener's eye.
Growing up, all of us knew to never pass Kelldale after dark. A housing estate somewhere around 30 minutes walk away. Yet, it could have been a whole different country to us. Back then, 8 PM had been our curfew, and to be honest, I never even thought to push my luck, racing home before sundown, door locked and TV switched on. The reasons why may have seemed trivial, ridiculous even, considering it was barely even more than a rumour. But that glimmer of truth behind it, a possibility of something almost too awful to comprehend lurking behind the tale, still ensured I was never home late, never to test it. I'm pretty sure it had been Gramps who'd first shared it with me. He'd always lived close to the estate, probably one of the last few residents here who hadn't moved away. He could still remember Kelldale, back when those housing plots were new. In those times, no one would ever consider how a place so affluent would one day be tainted with rumours so dark. Those rumours still spoken by the kids today, told in torchlight at sleepovers, whispered around the dying embers of countless campfires. Murders, a maniac hunting people in a van, multiple disappearances, alongside a flurry of other disquieting statements. But somehow, it always stuck. The place felt, I don't know, stained. So, we never pushed our luck, and never, ever on July 15th, when the residents of Kelldale vacated and the suburb fell silent. A time I later discovered carried a name. I don't remember when Gramps first told me, just being sworn to secrecy, as he knew he was keeping me up way past my bedtime, filling my head with unsettling stories, something we had a shared love for. A name which, even back in his youth, had been spoken about in hushed terms. Knife Sharpener's Night. So many kids knew the Kelldale tradition, yet have no idea of the origins, the heritage. Leave a rusty knife on your doorstep in July, and the knife sharpener might pass you by. And sure enough, so many Kelldale residents did just that. Gramps told me, in fact, they still do, but few outside of Kelldale know the real reason why. A story best untold. After all, you wouldn't want to bring down the cost of those alluring Kelldale houses. But thanks to Gramps, I know the real reason. He'd grown up in living in the shadows of Kelldale a lifetime ago, playing with the estate kids on the regular when they sometimes played baseball in the nearby fields, but never being invited to play on the estate. No local kids were ever invited in past that gleaming, welcoming sign. To do so would of course be frowned upon. What Gramps was told had been passed to him by a kid from Kelldale, told to them by a friend, the same thing relayed to that person by a brother of a schoolmate, told to them by their neighbour. Anyway, that list was long, but they all still heeded the caution. To many of the locals, Kelldale was the pinnacle of the American dream. The luxurious, expensive housing estate far from the city, where properties sold for a fortune. The kind of place where the residents are so rich that you know someone could go missing in there, and they would never be seen again. Kelldale had been pretty special back in the day. The estate had been built back in the early 50s, one of those fancy new suburbs out of the city. The guy behind it, Edgar Kelldale, was eager to make an impression. A little taste of suburbia with the amenities of upper-class city living. No expense was spared. And of course, it also offered him the rare opportunity to surround himself with his nearest and dearest, not just family, but his doctor, the chief of police, his lawyer, etc. It was the perfect flex, ensuring he had everyone he needed right on his doorstep. Freshly painted picket white fences and perfectly groomed lawns, flowers manicured to absolute perfection by a regular throng of workers, all diligently focused on keeping those residents happy, safe out of the hubbub from the city. Pre-Amazon, a flurry of service providers regularly delivered to the estate. Everything from laundry, food deliveries, tailoring, heck, anything to make them feel like they weren't quite so far away from civilization. This was horticulture suburbia, with pretty much everything you could have ever wanted, right there on your doorstep. People had spoken fondly about those sweltering hot summers waiting for Patrick Sullivan, the old ice cream man. They said you could hear the shrieks of excited kids before you even caught the jingle of the bell on Sullivan's shiny white van, or smelt that sweet, sweet aroma of melted chocolate poured over thick wafer. Or there was Paul Delahue, who ran the local delicatessen, his vast freezer van rolling up every weekend, offering a plethora of the finest cold cuts and various joints of meats to the neighbours, beaming smiles from happy husbands as they readied their barbecues, slabs of meat slammed onto sizzling hot grills in a thick summer air filling with the alluring smell of smoking barbecue. But one service had stood out amidst the others, one which, even back then, had seemed a little niche, somewhat old-fashioned. Sal Cutler, the knife sharpening man. Gramps had been told about that old black truck of Sal's, its ominous tolling bell which seemed to echo around the neighbourhood every week, summoning Sal's customers. No shrieking kids came with that bell. No sir, they kept their distance. It wasn't like Sal had ever been mean to anyone, but he carried an air of menace and respect. A tall mountain of a man, who you certainly wouldn't wish to meet down a dark alley at night. You didn't mess with Sal. Someone with a van full of sharp objects made for the purpose of cutting and slicing meat into small portions. Sal's business was simple. Knife sharpening at a fair price with a collection of payment the following week. It was only fair he'd told the suburb, ain't no rush, ain't going nowhere. Sal's customers were loyal. The man was a master of his art. Customers who worked in the city would often leave their wares on their doorstep for Sal, who dutifully collect and sharpen their knives to perfection. Gramps was told of the sounds that emanated from Sal's van, the grinder inside which seemed to wail and scream as dull metal was sharpened into fine, deadly points, that sound earning him a moniker amongst the younger kids, the Knife Scream man. Then Sal would carefully take the still-warm blades and wrap them in muslin cloth, before gently returning them to their respective porches, always accompanied by a bill in Sal's trademark, nigh-illegible handwriting. The braver kids would often dare each other to glimpse into Sal's portable workshop when he worked, shelves of hanging blades catching in the sunlight above a monstrous grinder, a glimpse into another world, one filled with reflective surfaces and hideous screeches. Sal offered little of the small talk or pleasantries which came with both the ice cream truck or food deliveries. Instead, he treated the simple act of knife sharpening with complete reverence. It was his duty, ensuring this tradition was performed with precision and the utmost care, something which his customers seemed to appreciate. Then, one day, there'd been some sort of dispute, an argument over Sal's work from an angry customer. The man in question, Frank Ligari, businessman, loudmouth and self-appointed head of the neighborhood watch, Frank considered himself pretty much the voice of the community, and everyone knew better than to question him.
"It's not good enough, I ain't paying for it,"
Frank had backed at the knife sharpener. A crowd had quickly gathered. No one had ever argued with Sal before, and now a plethora of residents had been quick to emerge from behind closed doors, eager to see the outcome. Wide eyes fixed on the two men now facing off against each other, but Sal had remained calm throughout the altercation, staring Frank down. Then slowly he'd nodded and taken the knife with him.
Be back tomorrow.
As promised, the following day that same tolling bell announced Sal's return, and with him that same knife, re-delivered to the unhappy customer, the blade gleaming and somehow even more polished to perfection. But once again, Frank had balked at the sight of the knife, critiquing its state.
It's the $100 blade you butchered. It's been hacked to shreds.
Sal had stared at the man once more and simply told him,
Blade's good. Pay up.
But more eyes had been focused this time round on Frank. The residents knew there would be no backing down. Instead, Frank had laughed in the knife sharpener's face.
Ain't happening. No way I'd pay for this poor excuse of craftsmanship. And for that matter, no one else should pay theirs neither. Your services are no longer needed, Sal.
Frank knew he'd already won. None of the other neighbours would ever dare argue with him, and true enough, none did. Instead, a hush had fallen over the crowd, a few residents trading worried glances, but none would step up. It was true, Sal was respected, but few would want to disagree with Frank. To go against him would be to endure an endless tide of gossip. Murmurs of agreements were slow at first, rippling through the watchers. A couple of the older residents protested. Sal was reliable, this wasn't fair, but Frank shot them down quickly. To Frank, Sal had been a guest in their neighbourhood, and now he was disrespecting that welcome with his poor workmanship. Supposedly, Sal had stared back at the other residents, anger and sadness rising in his cold black eyes. Then Sal had simply nodded, stating solemnly,
Payment's due. I'll collect next week.
And true to his word, that same low bell echoed out across Kelldale the following Friday as the rumble of the knife sharpener's van approached. But Frank had been busy in the interim, galvanizing his stance to ensure that no one would dare go against his word. Sal would not be paid. He was no longer welcome in Kelldale. To Frank, Sal was nothing more than a relic, telling the residents of Kelldale that Sal's work was merely an outdated service now provided by an outdated man. When Sal had arrived that day, no new knives awaited him. Only empty porches lay before the knife sharpener. Inside their houses, the residents hid themselves away, curtains drawn as Sal's trademark steady tread approached each of his customers' doors. A clatter of something on the porch before those slow footsteps drew away once more. When the low rumble of the van finally drew away, each resident had emerged to be greeted with the same sight. The remaining knives, freshly sharpened, and all accompanied by a bill. Except no one paid their bills, and no one took their knives.
We ain't paying him. He'll give up eventually,
had snapped Frank. But Sal didn't go away. The weeks passed, and just like he'd promised, Sal returned every week to collect. Gradually the knives on the porches grew rusty and the bills piled up, but no one dared to take them in. Instead, they hid themselves away, drawing their curtains each time the sound of the knife sharpener's bell rang out. As days passed by, it was reported that Sal's behaviour had grown increasingly odd. Sometimes the van's bell was heard late into the night. Residents would peer out into the summer night claiming to have seen a large van pass by. Others would report a tall figure quietly knocking on their doors before leaving. Over time, these complaints had garnered momentum and eventually the police had been notified, but they claimed when attempts were made to visit Sal's store, they had found it vacant, closed indefinitely. Sal had shut up shop. And yet, he just kept turning up. Then one July morning, the heat had hung low over the neighbourhood. The 15th July heatwave. Kids paddled in their pools or held water fights in the street. The hot air filled with joyful screams and shouts, but then one scream had cut through the heat. A scream which had brought the neighbours running. One of the local kids, Jimmy Larksfield, A small boy with a nervous disposition had been sprawled in the road. Sal's black van sat idling beside him, driver's door ajar as a large figure inside had shakily clambered out. The boy was whimpering, his ankle sprained, and a myriad of visible cuts and bruises covered his legs, but otherwise he'd seemed fine. But Sal had been shaken. The first time the residents had seen him like that. He'd been jabbering, stating,
"I hadn't seen him. He came out of nowhere."
but this was the opportunity Frank had been waiting for, and he was primed to perform to his crowd.
"Maniac! Out of control!"
A barrage of inflammatory phrases were hurled forth at the knife sharpener. A child had now been injured and suddenly everything had changed. The taper had been lit. The crowd quick to anger, and as voices were raised, Sal had leapt back inside his van. The great man suddenly looking so vulnerable against a baying mob of residents. An onslaught of angry fists had rained down against the side of his cab, Kelldale's inhabitants violently rocking the van as more and more people gathered. Sal was surrounded. Then, in a cloud of exhaust smoke, the panicked knife sharpener had fled, careering back towards the highway. But Frank and his mob wouldn't be quick to let this go. Gramps said how he'd been told some had stood by, but a handful of vengeful residents climbed in their cars, pursuing the swerving truck. It was later speculated that Sal had been driving too fast, wild-eyed and keen to evade the angered crowd. Perhaps those great, shaking hands taking that first turning just a little too quickly. Old wheels losing traction on hot asphalt as tires squealed and the van slowly turned, tilting off the road before crashing hard into the fence which bordered the next town. A hideous shriek of twisting metal as the vehicle had crumpled into splintering wood. Then silence. Then one by one, the residents had arrived. Some in vehicles, others by foot. Curious eyes on the now smoking knife-sharpening van. They said through the shattered windshield the large man inside lay broken, bloody-browed, wild-eyed, gasping, pleading for help. But no one listened. Instead, the residents watched the petrol gurgle and flow from the gas tank, slowly pooling under the vehicle. They would also watch as flames began to lick the cab, backing away as the smoke rose. Murmurs of concern had risen. Shouldn't they call someone? But Frank ensured no one phoned it in. Of course, by the time the emergency services were called, it was all too late. The fire, impenetrable. No one had attempted to free the man. It was said Sal's screams were heard for miles. The whole event didn't even make the news, played down by Edgar Kelldale, who was insistent the incident would be terrible press for the neighborhood. Witness reports would later detail how Sal had been driving too fast. That proof was evident with the injured boy. Few spoke the truth, of the boy dashing out into the road carelessly to retrieve a ball, not looking where he was going. But the older residents knew the truth, but all said little, holding their tongues. They knew the cost of speaking out. And just like that, in a matter of days, the neighborhood had seemingly returned back to normality. All that had remained of Sal was the story. The fence replaced, freshly painted, those rusty knives and bills mostly put into the trash, forgotten. Families slept restfully in their houses once more. No more curtain twitching, no more sightings of the van outside their window, no bell waking them from their sleep. But the older residents hadn't slept so easy. They refused to throw out their knives, a testament of their guilt, a memorial to a senseless tragedy. Then, the incidents started. Slowly at first. Just a handful of kids who said they'd heard Sal's bell late at night. Glimpses of his van, the front still indented, charred, the great vehicle crawling along the streets in the early hours. Pure campfire story fodder. And of course, no one believed it. Not until Frank vanished on July 15th. It was later deduced by police that Frank had been missing for 48 hours by the time his wife Maris reported him as missing. Maris had been absent from home after spending the weekend visiting a sick relative. But on her arrival back to the household, she'd found the property vacant. Initially, nothing had appeared out of place, and for Maris, the only signs of anything remotely odd had simply been Frank's absence and the couple's knife drawer, which was found completely emptied. That evening, a local group of teenagers walking home from football practice would report hearing a sound akin to a man screaming, accompanied with another noise, one which they would describe as machine-like, akin to a grinder. The group had dismissed the sounds, deciding it to purely be the work of an elaborate prankster, in turn failing to notify the authorities until long after the incident. Over a week later, Frank's body was discovered in a patch of waste ground by a dog walker. The corpse had suffered under the summer heat, amplified by the fact that his entire torso had been embedded with knives. Knives which were later found to have been those taken from Frank and Maris's property. A cop working the crime scene would later describe Frank's bloated corpse as more pincushion than person. During his autopsy, a single piece of paper had been found crammed into Frank's esophagus. A receipt. The words "paid in full" scrawled in nigh illegible handwriting. The discovery of Frank's body shook the community to the core. Wild speculations grew around the murder, but suggestions of the death being attributed to Sal had quickly been laid to rest. The knife sharpener had long been buried. A friend of a friend had worked the service, his tall frame encased in wood before being lowered 6 feet under. The knife sharpener was worm food. But soon, other theories found traction. Was Frank's death the work of an unknown associate of the late knife sharpener, seeking vengeance for his friend's death? But Sal had no known family, no real friends. He kept himself to himself. And there was no concrete evidence of any other questionable persons lurking around the neighborhood. The older residents had pointedly remarked that for Sal, the majority of his customers had been his friends, his family, and the neighborhood's rebuke had been the greatest of betrayals. Slowly, eyes turned to Frank's past. It was no secret he'd been a keen gambler, his friends citing how regularly he'd been in the red rather than in the green. His gaming circle often included a myriad of lowlives and two-bit crooks. It was eventually concluded that Frank had simply crossed someone from the wrong side of the tracks. That was all there was to it. Case closed. Following Frank's burial, the other residents had done their best to put the incident behind them. Frank had been a braggart, and well, to be honest, they were glad to be rid of him. That is until the following July 15th. When it had all started again. A cluster of crumbled bills left on porches, payment due, scrawled in that same nigh illegible handwriting, and an ominous black van said to have been sighted on the city limits in the morning light, quickly disappearing out of sight when the police were sent to investigate. Again, the police chief Davis shrugged it off, giving little thought to the incident. Just kids joking around. But when nightfall rolled around on July 15th, the majority of residents had been quick to lock themselves away, many later reporting the sound of Sal's bell after dark, only this time it had sounded discorded, broken. Then later that same sound of slow, heavy footsteps approaching each resident's doorstep, knocking, waiting. But with the morning sun had simply come confused faces tinged with relief. Any supposed danger seemingly passing. Surely it had just been the work of some dedicated prankster. Until they realized another resident had vanished. Jimmy McFarlane, retired gym teacher and gun nut. Prior to his disappearance, Jimmy had laughed at the events.
Let them try their luck with me, any place, any time.
But when Jimmy was found days later, in a small wood on the south side of the city, it was evident someone had clearly taken their time with the man. A look of pure terror was said to have been etched on his face. Once more, the entirety of the resident's knife drawer embedded in his chest cavity, and once more, a receipt wedged in the skinny man's throat. Paid in full. The local paper was warned to play the matter down to avoid further bad press for the area. The body had been found on the town's limits after all, and it was quickly attributed to the neighbouring town. Not the local police's problem. Speculation rose. Jimmy had long been known to play cards with Frank. For the police chief, that's all there was to it. This wasn't a serial killer. This was just two men who'd strayed too far out of their depths and crossed the wrong people from the wrong city. In doing so, they'd both paid the ultimate price. Yet the residents were uneasy. A neighbourhood meeting was called. What should they do? Two murders which could arguably be linked with the death of the Knife Sharpener man. Many of the residents were beyond spooked, now discussing relocating, moving far from the area. But the cost of the housing lots in this part of the state had been high, expensive land agreements. Other locations were simply too much to take on and would mean moving even further from the city. Kelldale's plots were gold dust, a social status. People worked long and hard for them. Besides, whatever these issues were, they only seemed to arise around July 15th, a time when most families were on vacation. The deaths were suspicious, true, but the bodies found miles away, not on their porches, not their problem. A compromise was decided upon. Should there be any truth in the now swirling rumours and a seeming vendetta on behalf of the dead Knife Sharpener, then why take a chance to find out? The next July 15th, the estates would be empty. And so, the following July 15th, Kelldale remained silent. Families went to visit friends or holidayed elsewhere. No one would be around to find out if there was any substance to the stories. Easier to ignore than to confront what might be lurking on their doorstep. But of course, there was a price. There's always a price. The police later found that it had been a widow, Joan Sixsmith, who'd been first to return from her vacation. Her car being found in her driveway on July 18th, several days after the suburb was vacated. But when a neighbour knocked for Joan, she was gone. And so were her knives. Joan was never seen again. The official line, Joan had money troubles, met some guy upstate on vacation, had fled in the night. But a handful of stories still persisted. Stories alleging Joan had indeed been found. Her body uncovered by the local police in Scrubland. Another torso punctured with a drawer full of sharpened knives, left to rot, miles from the neighbourhood. In Joan's throat, another receipt. Only a different message, in that same handwriting this time.
Nice try.
But the police chief didn't want another murder on his hands, nor to own a house in a suburb which would be associated with multiple violent murders. Neither he nor his friends could afford that. The body had been removed, the whole incident dealt with by Edgar Kelldale himself. It didn't just stop with the current residents, because when those houses got passed down, whatever it was just kept coming back. It was deduced. Whoever was behind these murders wanted their yearly pound of flesh, and so it's said from point onwards, they got just that. Vagrants, hitchhikers, door-to-door salespeople called out on business to an empty housing estate, always yearly on July 15th. And none were ever seen again. From what I understand, those houses are now worth a fortune. There is of course a strict community vetting process if you want a place there. Most of these houses got passed down through family, and for anyone new, well, there are certain rules you have to abide by to be deemed a good neighbour. Again, I know all of this just sounds like perfect campfire fare, right? Had to be. Anyway, that story kept me awake long after Gramps told me. Sure enough, it had been early July, and no matter what I did, I just couldn't shake the image of that rolling, charred wreck and the horror inside it. Gramps had checked in on me later that night, clearly guilt-ridden for telling me something he clearly shouldn't have. He tried to put my mind at ease, reminding me that Kelldale was far from the sanctuary of our street. But just the thought of there being any truth in the tale left me feeling uneasy. It had already burrowed itself deep into my subconscious, and that night I slept very badly. My head filled with tolling bells, rusty knives, and a shadowy thing in a van who would never stop hunting. I knew things would never be the same again, no matter what would happen. I would always listen out for that bell in July. This was all so long ago. True, the neighbourhood hadn't been that far from us, but I'd always remembered Gramps' words and never ever cycle past late at night. Nor, most importantly, to ever go close on July 15th. Anyway, Gramps passed a while back, and I guess that story started to fade over time. But still, I stuck to my guns. Most of the local kids had heard various rumours, schoolyard rhymes, etc., but few knew the real story. Regardless, I never wanted to test if it was real or not. Years had passed, and then one evening, around mid-July, I'd found myself cycling back home way later than I'd intended. Evening sunset descending into murky summer night. As I'd cycled, I spotted two figures emerging out of the haze, lugging heavy backpacks. I recognised them instantly, their lumbering gait unmistakable. Isaac and Ben, a couple of older kids from my school. We knew little of each other, an occasional nod shared between us, but I never really hung out with them. They had a reputation, skipping school, stealing, lighting fires. A general bad vibe followed them. Anyhow, it had been Ben who'd been first to turn, shouting, "Hey!" his face all smiles. On reflection, I should have returned the acknowledgement and carried on cycling, but something made me stop. Maybe it had been the fact that the journey had been long and I was feeling kind of bored. Regardless, I knew as soon as I stopped and asked them, "What's up?" that I'd made a mistake.
We're going to Kelldale. We heard that the whole estate is empty every year on this day. Can you imagine the stuff in those rich people's houses? Dude, it'll be such a payout.
I'd stiffened at the name Kelldale. Fuck, how the hell had I forgotten it was July 15th? But I'd maintained pleasantries. I knew I was now on dangerous ground. All I had to do was gently remove myself from the situation, get back on my bike and ride. But in that moment, my mouth ran, and I found myself questioning aloud if maybe it was the right move. Surely someone would be around. Ben's demeanour had been quick to change.
What, you some kind of expert on the area? You think you know better?
A look had flashed between the two boys, then Ben's smile had slowly broadened.
Hey, tell you what, why don't you come along? That way we'll have a lookout and we can keep an eye on you. You can leave the bike here.
I knew that hadn't been an invitation. It was an order. There was stale beer on their breath and a wildness in their eyes. Both of these guys were at least a foot taller than me. Plus, I'd heard for a fact Isaac had put a kid in hospital just for making a snarky remark about him at soccer practice. I was way out of my depth, and still a long way from home. I wouldn't have even put it past them to decide to beat the living shit out of me, and leave me all the way out here where no one would find my body. So, I found myself dutifully nodding and gently leaning my bike against a fence. Then, slowly, I'd followed them over scrubland towards the lights on the horizon. That long private road that led to Kelldale. I trailed somewhat as we'd crossed that scrubland, every inch of me screaming to run back. All the while the two knuckleheads in front of me entertaining themselves, discussing what they were going to do with their spoils. Me, I found myself sheepishly keeping eyes on the dark around us, each step moving closer to somewhere I'd spent my entire life avoiding. Ever questioning that what if somewhere, just beyond, something else might be watching us. Waiting. In no time at all, those estate gates were looming out of the darkness in front of us. Kelldale. I'd never seen the sign so close before. Its elaborate Art Deco board full of an American charm from yesteryear, welcoming visitors to the place I knew I was never, ever to go near. Beyond the board lay the gates, open, and beyond that, street after street of immaculate houses with manicured lawns. And if Ben and Isaac were right, absolutely not a single human being. The realization had clearly hit the boys too, as I'd realized they suddenly stopped talking. Then Ben had glanced at Isaac, and cupping his hands had emitted the longest echoing crow I think I'd ever heard. Soon Isaac joined him, crowing, long and hard into the night. The noise had been ear-splitting, cutting through the quiet. If there was anyone around, then we were surely toast. I'd braced myself, eyes on the houses, watching for any sign of lights. Angry, disturbed residents rising from their slumber. We stood like that, on tenterhooks, waiting for a good 5 minutes, watching for any sign of movement. But the road remained quiet. No angry residents came. Just rows of empty windows looked down upon us. We were alone, in an empty estate. Isaac had eagerly started unpacking a rucksack, gloves, a screwdriver, and to my absolute horror, a crowbar and hammer. A flashlight was thrust into my hand, and a finger shoved in my face.
Hey, don't dream of going anywhere. Keep eyes out for anyone, and crow if you hear anything.
I'd nodded obediently. I wasn't stupid enough to take these guys on. Besides, I was saving all my strength for running. My plan, wait until these goons were out of sight, then hotfoot it as fast as humanly possible back towards my bike. The walk had been long, but I figured I could sprint in 15 minutes, maybe 10 at a push. So humbly I'd nodded, then watched as they'd both stumbled off towards the first house. Then slowly, I'd slunk behind a bush, attempting to get comfortable beside a stack of garbage bags which had been piled high ready for collection. Of course, only then, deep under prickled leaves and wet trash bags, had it suddenly occurred to me to put my hoodie up. Suddenly conscious of being under the watchful eyes of countless door cams, the thick material of the hoodie enveloping my sweating face, but protecting me from the putrid stench of the garbage bags. I'd felt woozy. The air was thicker down here with the buzzing of insects, musky, dense, and I could have been mistaken, but for some reason, it felt like there was a weird tension in the air. I'd watched as Isaac and Ben had finally disappeared somewhere around the back of the first house on the left. Number 1, a large building which clearly had been expanded from the original 3-bedroom plot. Now this place was big, and I knew, no matter how well I'd be hidden, I was barely concealed. Those dark windows more like sunken eyes watching my every move. Shaking that feeling, I focused on the plan at hand, aiming to give Ben and Isaac 5 minutes to enter. Time to give me enough of a buffer to get the hell out of this creepy abandoned neighbourhood and back to my bike and home. Somewhere in the distance, I could now hear the 2 boys fumbling with the door. Angry slams resonated out as what sounded like a crowbar indented itself over and over into wood. Reactively, I watched for any reaction from the estate, preparing for a twitch of a curtain in a window or a flicker of porch light, but none ever came. Then finally the slamming stopped, and the murmur of voices muffled. I'd taken a breath, now convinced they had gained entry. I'd looked around. The route back to the gates was clear. It was now or never. Slowly, I'd risen from the bush, swiping away at leaves and the clouds of fruit flies now drowsily rising from the garbage bags. It had been then, as I'd started making my way towards the exit, when I'd first felt the crunch beneath my sneaker. It sounded like paper, only thicker, coarse and brittle. I'd paused, confused, bending down in the darkness, scrabbling for the shape before my fingertips connected with something. I'd held it aloft, slowly turning it over. My guess had been right. It was paper. Only this wasn't freshly thrown out. This paper looked ancient, decades old, like it was from the 1950s. I'd stepped into the streetlight next to me, trying to get visibility on the thing in my hands. It had been then when I'd seen the words, caught now in the glimmer of the neon glow, and I'd felt my stomach lurch. I was holding a bill, old, weather-worn, and crumpled, atop which 2 words were scrawled in nigh intelligible handwriting.
Payment due.
I'm not sure how long I'd stood there. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes, but it was a sound from somewhere behind me which had eventually broken my attention, making me snap back to reality. At first I'd taken it to be the sound of glass breaking, initially taking it to be Isaac and Ben now carelessly entering another part of the house, smashing their way through someone's possessions, both knowing they'd be free of consequences. Then a realization had struck. That sound. The high-pitched tone. The recognition dawning on me like a cold ice running down my neck and through my veins. Not a window. The register was too high. Too discorded. It had been a chime. Seconds later, I was ducked back behind the bush, trying not to hyperventilate, and in doing so, inadvertently inhaling fruit flies and foul garbage fumes. I'd covered my mouth, stifling coughs as my chest tightened and my eyes began to water. I had to stay silent. Needed to stay silent. And that's when the largest of shadows had slowly passed silently over my hiding spot. A truck. Far taller than any other I'd seen. So much so, it had taken a moment for it to register its silhouette. Then slowly, that realization of what I was actually seeing. A relic, pulled out of the past, and now in an era where it shouldn't exist. In the glimmer of streetlights, I could now just about make out the signs of fire. Once thick paintwork charred the damage covering the truck's entirety. Rusted panelwork and windows now blackened with soot, concealing the interior and hiding the driver. Once elaborate hand-painted signage on the side of the vehicle, now blistered and near illegible. All for 2 words, warped and distorted. Knife Sharpening. I was gagging now, trying not to freak out, nor make a sound as my chest felt like it was genuinely going to explode. Terrified, I'd watched the van draw up some way past my hiding place, noiselessly rolling to a stop outside number 1, before the squeal of the driver's door pierced the silence. With wide eyes, I now saw the driver emerge, its large frame tilting the van as it clambered out. The shape, just about visible in one of a few lit street lamps. The figure was big, tall with a posture more akin to a museum statue than a human. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I caught sight of its tattered uniform, in which I could now see large hands, made for working metal, slowly feeling for something in a pocket. I may have been somewhat back, but I could see in the glow of the neon lights how the skin didn't look right. If anything, it looked rotten to me. Mottled. Blistered. I'd felt vomit rising in my throat, and through my horror I must have inadvertently coughed, swallowing acid reflux back down. Immediately, the figure turned, and though I couldn't see their eyes, I knew they were now focused on my hiding spot. I'd held my breath, making myself as still and as small as humanly possible, burying deeper into the garbage, gulping back wretches as those putrid garbage fumes hit my nostrils. Beyond, I could now see the figure staring directly towards me. Dead eyes, looking, searching the leaves of the bush. I'd held my breath and waited for a seeming eternity, pleading, no, begging silently for the figure to pass me by, to turn away, but instead, the figure had tentatively drawn a long, thin shape from the pocket, the shape instantly catching in the amber hue of the streetlight. Cold, shimmering metal. Then slowly, the figure had begun to walk towards my hiding spot. But the noise from inside the house had made the figure stop dead in its tracks. It had waited, cocking its head like a bird, as if listening to something just out of... Followed by another crash. The figure spun, attention now firmly back on the house as the sound of Ben and Isaac's crime spree cut through the quiet. The boys were laughing now, audibly celebrating the chaos of their work, their laughter echoing out across the empty plots. In seconds, the figure was up the steps of the porch of number 1, a monstrous hand knocking on the pristine wood of the door. For the briefest of seconds, I saw it raise the thing in its hands, that glimmer of metal. The largest of knives now sharpened to perfection. In that instant I ran. I ran faster than I could ever remember. In under 10 seconds I was out of Kelldale. A minute later I was over a street away running through empty scrubland, flashlight off, darkness surrounding me. 5 minutes later I was lost, desperately trying to find the street with my bike. but I wouldn't dare use the flashlight in my hand. Instead, I'd felt frantically, trying to find the wall I'd rested my ride on. Step after stumbling step, I inhaled lungfuls of hot summer air, so dense that it felt like my lungs could quite possibly explode at any moment. But I couldn't stop running. Nothing would make me stop. Then, success! That red framework of my bike undeniable in the musk of the night in front of me, still leaning by the low wall. Quickly, I'd climbed aboard, allowing myself a moment to catch my breath, satisfying my lungs' need for air. Then, when I could breathe easy once more, I'd waited and listened. Silence. The kind which rang out for miles. A faint growl of traffic somewhere in the distance. The July air now cooling the quiet chorus of cicadas and... No, not one scream, but two screams, now echoing somewhere far, far away, somewhere in a direction I just run from. That sound I could even hear so clearly now, so distant but filled with absolute terror and pain. A second later I was gone, pedaling so fast I nearly crashed twice in the dark, aiming for the major roads, something I'd never usually do, seeking the sanctuary of traffic and lights and taking the long way home, taking me well over an hour till I reached the safety of my driveway. It won't surprise you to know that Ben and Isaac were never seen again. There were rumours, of course. Skip town, the authorities said. Bad news, my school friends said, but Isaac and Ben were the kinds of kids you don't go looking for. The boys had long talked of their plans to break out of the area. Spare for a handful of pleas from their families, people were quick to let them go. A handful of missing posters slowly taken down, faded in the sun to ghosts. I don't blame them. Over the following weeks, I kept a close eye on break-ins in the local press. It probably also won't surprise you to know none were reported at Kelldale. But then again, why would they? Some broken glass, low-level breakages, and another year of respite. The quietness returning. I guess I never told anyone about that night until now, and I never passed Kelldale ever again. But sometimes, if I'm ever out riding in the month of July, when the moon is high and the air is thick with summer, I swear, I still hear that bell.